I'm Rachel Williams, 42, and 13 years ago I lost my husband David in the Fukushima nuclear disaster while he was working as a nuclear safety consultant for an American engineering firm. For over a decade, I've fought both the Japanese government and his former company for proper compensation. Living on a modest survivor's pension while raising our 2 children alone in Oregon, last month, I finally received a settlement offer of $2 million, but when I demanded accountability for the safety violations that cost my husband's life, their lawyer called me emotionally unstable and threatened to withdraw the offer entirely. What they don't know is that I've spent 13 years quietly gathering evidence, and I'm about to expose the truth that will bring down everyone responsible. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. If you've ever been dismissed while fighting for justice, like this video because this story will show you exactly how to make them pay. March 11, 2011, I can still remember every detail of that Friday afternoon in Portland. I was folding laundry in our small 2-bedroom apartment, Emma napping in her crib at just 4 years old, while 6-year-old Michael played with his Legos on the living room floor. The late afternoon sun streamed through our kitchen window, and I was actually humming, genuinely happy for the first time in months. David had been in Japan for 3 weeks, working as a nuclear safety consultant for Morrison Engineering. The assignment at Fukushima Daiichi was supposed to be routine safety assessment and protocol review that would pay enough to finally get us out of our cramped apartment and into a real house. We'd been saving for years, and this job was our ticket to financial stability. My phone buzzed with a text from David. I smiled, expecting his usual missing you message or a photo of some interesting Japanese food he'd tried. Instead, the message made my blood run cold. Something's wrong with the cooling system. They're telling us to stay. I immediately tried calling him back. The call went straight to voicemail. I tried again. Nothing. That's when I turned on the news. The earthquake footage was devastating: buildings swaying like trees in the wind, roads cracking open, cars being swept away by water. But it was the aerial shots of Fukushima Daiichi that made my legs give out. I sank onto our couch, watching smoke billowing from the reactor buildings, while news anchors spoke in urgent tones about cooling system failures and potential meltdowns. "Mommy, what's wrong?" Michael appeared beside me, his Lego creation forgotten. I couldn't speak, I just pulled him close, my hands shaking as I kept hitting redial on David's number. For the next 6 hours, I lived in a nightmare of conflicting reports. International news said foreign contractors had been evacuated. Morrison Engineering's emergency hotline kept insisting all their personnel were safe and accounted for. But David's phone remained silent, and that text message they're telling us to stay kept flashing in my mind. At 11:47 p.m. Pacific time, my phone finally rang. But it wasn't David, it was James Morrison himself, the company's founder. "Rachel, I need you to know that David was a hero today," he said, his voice heavy with what I would later recognize as carefully practiced grief. "There was an explosion in Reactor Building 1. David and 6 other consultants were conducting emergency safety protocols when they were overcome by radiation exposure." The world tilted. Overcome? What does that mean? Where is he? Is he in a hospital? "Rachel, I'm so sorry. David didn't make it out." I don't remember much of what happened next. I know I screamed. I know Michael started crying. I know our neighbor Mrs. Chen came over because she heard the commotion and stayed with the kids while I collapsed in the bathroom, vomiting from shock. What I do remember with crystal clarity is James Morrison's next words: "We're going to take care of you and the children." David died serving his country and protecting innocent people. His sacrifice won't be forgotten. At the time, those words felt like a lifeline. I had no idea they were the first lies in what would become a web of deception. The lies started immediately, though I was too grief-stricken to recognize them at first. 3 days after David's death, Morrison Engineering released an official statement to the media. All Morrison Engineering personnel were successfully evacuated from the Fukushima facility prior to the reactor explosions. "We are working closely with Japanese authorities to account for any contractors who may have been in the area." I stared at the press release in disbelief. James Morrison had personally told me David died in the explosion. Now they were claiming he was evacuated. I called Morrison's emergency line again, my hands shaking as I dialed. This is Rachel Williams, David Williams' wife. Your press release says he was evacuated, but Mr. Morrison told me he died in the explosion. Which is it? The woman on the phone put me on hold for nearly 20 minutes. When she returned, her voice was carefully neutral. Mrs. Williams, I'm transferring you to our legal department. They'll be better equipped to handle your inquiry. Legal department, 3 days after my husband's death. And they were already treating me like a liability instead of a grieving widow. The lawyer, Patricia Chunno, relation to my neighbor, was smooth and professional. Mrs. Williams, there's been some confusion. In our initial reports, we're still working with Japanese authorities to confirm the exact circumstances of the incident. What I can tell you is that Morrison Engineering will honor all contractual obligations regarding Mr. Williams' employment. I don't care about contractual obligations, I said, my voice rising. I want to know what happened to my husband. Your CEO told me he died in an explosion. Your press release says he was evacuated. I need the truth. Mrs. Williams, I understand your frustration, but you have to understand the situation is very fluid. Information is changing rapidly. What's important now is ensuring you and your children are taken care of. That phrase, taken care of, would haunt me for years. It was never about truth or justice. It was about managing their liability. Over the next week, I made 17 phone calls to Morrison Engineering. Each time, I was transferred to a different person, given conflicting information, or told they were still gathering facts. The story kept changing. David was evacuated, then he wasn't. He was in the reactor building, then he was in a separate facility. He died from radiation exposure, then from structural collapse, then from complications related to the incident. The breaking point came when I received Morrison Engineering's initial incident report in the mail. According to their official documentation, David Williams was successfully evacuated from Fukushima Daiichi at 15:30 JST on March 11, 2011, and transported to a safe facility 30 kilometers from the plant. The report concluded, all Morrison Engineering personnel accounted for and safe. I called James Morrison directly, bypassing his assistants by pretending to be a reporter from the Portland Tribune. Mr. Morrison, this is Rachel Williams. You told me my husband died in the reactor explosion. Your report says he was evacuated safely. Are you lying to me, or are you lying to the public? The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When Morrison finally spoke, his voice had lost all warmth. Mrs. Williams, I understand you're grieving, but making accusations isn't going to bring David back. Our legal team will be in touch regarding survivor benefits. He hung up. That night, as I tucked Emma and Michael into bed, Emma asked me, when is Daddy coming home? I realized I couldn't even answer that simple question truthfully, because Morrison Engineering couldn't decide whether David was dead or alive. The financial reality hit me 2 weeks after David's death when our life insurance company, Mutual Assurance Corp., sent me a denial letter that felt like a punch to the gut. David's $500,000 policy, our safety net, the thing that was supposed to take care of me and the kids if something happened to him, was being denied under the Act of War Exclusion Clause. The Fukushima nuclear incident, the letter stated, resulted from military-grade seismic activity and subsequent infrastructure failure that falls under our policy's wartime exclusion provisions. We regret that we cannot provide coverage for this claim. Act of war. It was an earthquake and tsunami, not a military attack. But there it was, in black and white, our insurance company abandoning us when we needed them most, hiding behind legal technicalities while my children asked why. Daddy wasn't coming home. David's final paycheck from Morrison Engineering was $3,847.82. Our savings account held $2,100. The rent on our apartment was $1,200 a month. I had been a part-time bookkeeper before Emma was born, but my skills were rusty and the job market in 2011 was brutal. The math was simple and terrifying. We had maybe 2 months before we'd be homeless. That's when Portland's community stepped up in a way that still brings tears to my eyes. Our neighbor Mrs. Chen organized a meal train that lasted 3 months. The local Safeway where I shopped quietly covered our grocery bills. Emma's preschool waived tuition for the rest of the year. Strangers left anonymous envelopes of cash in our mailbox with notes like "For David's family" and "Thinking of you." The Portland Tribune ran a story titled "Local Father Dies Hero in Japan Nuclear Crisis." featuring the photo from our last Christmas together, David in his terrible holiday sweater, lifting Emma above his head, while Michael grinned, gap-toothed, beside them. The story brought more support. A local church collected $8,000 for us, and 3 different law firms called offering to help with the insurance claim. But it was the interview request from CNN that changed everything. The producer, Maria Santos, wanted to do a segment on American families affected by Fukushima. Your husband's story represents the human cost of nuclear energy, she told me, over the phone. People need to hear about his sacrifice. I agreed to the interview, thinking it might pressure the insurance company to reconsider their denial. What I didn't expect was Morrison Engineering's reaction. 2 days before the CNN crew was supposed to arrive, Patricia Chen called me. Mrs. Williams, we understand you're speaking to media outlets about David's death. Yes, I am. Is that a problem? Well, it could complicate things. We're still in discussions with Japanese authorities about the incident. Public statements could interfere with ongoing investigations. What investigations? You told me David was evacuated safely, remember? Another pause. Mrs. Williams, we'd like to offer you something that might help with your immediate financial concerns. Morrison Engineering is prepared to provide a survivor benefit of $75,000, plus continued health insurance for you and your children for 2 years. It wasn't life-changing money, but it would buy us time. What's the catch? No catch. We just need you to sign a standard confidentiality agreement regarding the details of David's assignment in Japan. There it was. Hush money. Even in my grief-addled state, I recognized it for what it was. They wanted to pay me to stay quiet about their lies and contradictions. I need to think about it, I told her. Of course, but Mrs. Williams, I should mention that media attention could complicate not just our investigation, but also your insurance claim. Insurance companies don't like uncertainty. The threat was subtle but clear. Take the money and stay quiet, or lose everything. That night, I sat in David's home office, surrounded by his nuclear engineering textbooks and safety manuals. He had dedicated his career to making nuclear power safer. He believed in transparency, in accountability, in doing the right thing even when it was difficult. I called CNN and confirmed the interview. If Morrison Engineering wanted to buy my silence, they'd picked the wrong widow. The CNN interview aired on April 15, 2011, exactly 5 weeks after David's death. Maria Santos had done her homework, contrasting Morrison Engineering's public statements about successful evacuations with James Morrison's admission to me that David had died in the explosion. The segment raised uncomfortable questions about corporate accountability and foreign worker safety in disaster zones. I thought it went well. Morrison Engineering apparently disagreed. Patricia Chen called me the next morning, her professional veneer finally cracking. Mrs. Williams, you've made a serious mistake. That interview contained several inaccuracies that could be considered defamatory toward Morrison Engineering. We're withdrawing our survivor benefit offer, and we'll be pursuing legal action if you continue making false public statements about our company. False statements. I quoted your CEO directly. James Morrison told me David died in the explosion. You have no proof of that conversation. She was right, and we both knew it. I hadn't recorded the call. It was my word against a multi-million corporation's carefully crafted public relations strategy. But 3 days later, something extraordinary happened. My phone rang at 6:23 a.m., jolting me awake. The caller ID showed an international number I didn't recognize. Mrs. Williams. The voice was heavily accented, cautious. My name is Dr. Kenji Yamamoto. I am calling from Japan. I worked at Fukushima Daiichi. I saw your interview on CNN. I sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. Dr. Yamamoto, do you know what happened to my husband? Yes, I know exactly what happened to your husband. And I know why Morrison Engineering is lying about it. My hands started shaking. Can you tell me? Not over the phone. Too dangerous. But I have documents. Safety reports that were ignored. Warnings about the reactor cooling systems that were filed months before the earthquake. Your husband died because people in power chose profit over safety. What kind of documents? Internal TEPCO memos about known vulnerabilities in Reactor Building 1, Morrison Engineering reports, recommending immediate safety upgrades that were rejected as too expensive. Communications between your husband and his supervisors about dangerous conditions that he was told to ignore. I could barely breathe. David knew it was dangerous. Your husband was a good man, Mrs. Williams. He filed 17 separate safety violations in his 3 weeks at Fukushima. 17. Each one was dismissed or delayed. The day of the earthquake, he refused to evacuate because he was trying to implement emergency protocols that might have prevented the worst of the radiation release. Tears were streaming down my face. This was the David I knew, the man who would risk his own life to protect others, who believed safety protocols existed for a reason. Dr. Yamamoto, why are you telling me this? Because 47 foreign workers died at Fukushima that day. 47. The official reports claim only Japanese personnel were lost. Your husband and 46 others have been erased from history to protect corporate and government interests. Someone must speak for them. Can you prove this? I have copies of everything. Safety reports, personnel logs, evacuation records, but I need to be careful. I still work in Japan's nuclear industry. If they discover I am talking to you, ... What do you need from me? Meet me in person. I will be in San Francisco next month for a nuclear safety conference. I can give you copies of the documents, but you must promise me something. Anything. Use them wisely. These papers represent the only proof that your husband and the others existed, that they died trying to prevent a catastrophe. Do not let their sacrifice be forgotten. We arranged to meet at a small cafe near the Moscone Center. On May 20th, Dr. Yamamoto would be carrying a conference bag and wearing a blue tie. I would wear a red scarf and carry a copy of David's favorite book, The Curve of Binding Energy by John McPhee. After he hung up, I sat in my dark bedroom for hours, processing what I'd learned. David hadn't just died in a random accident. He'd died trying to fix problems that his own company had ignored for months. He'd died because Morrison Engineering and TEPCO had valued money over human lives. But more than that, I now knew David wasn't alone. 46 other families somewhere in the world were grieving husbands, fathers, sons, who had been written out of the official story. 46 other families who deserved to know the truth about how their loved ones had died. Morrison Engineering had made a critical error when they called me emotionally unstable and tried to silence me with legal threats. They'd underestimated what a mother will do to honor her children's father and seek justice for the innocent. Dr. Yamamoto had just handed me the weapon I needed to fight back. The meeting with Dr. Yamamoto changed everything. On May 20, 2011, in a small cafe 3 blocks from the Moscone Center, he handed me a manila envelope that would become the foundation of my 13-year battle for justice. Inside were photocopies of internal safety reports, personnel evacuation logs, and most damning of all, an email chain between Morrison Engineering executives discussing acceptable loss parameters for foreign contractor operations. The documents painted a horrifying picture. David and the other foreign consultants weren't just aware of the safety violations, they were specifically assigned to the most dangerous areas because, as one Morrison email put it, international personnel carry less liability exposure than domestic employees. They were expendable. Armed with this evidence, I hired Portland attorney Michael Chun, Mrs. Chun's son, who had just started his own practice. Michael was young, hungry, and personally invested in our case. His first action was to send Morrison Engineering a formal document request demanding all communications related to David's assignment and death. Morrison's response was swift and brutal. Instead of documents, I received a cease and desist letter from their legal team at Preston and Associates, one of Seattle's most prestigious law firms. The letter accused me of industrial espionage, theft of proprietary information, and defamatory statements designed to damage Morrison Engineering's reputation and business relationships. But it was the next paragraph that truly revealed their strategy. Mrs. Williams' increasingly erratic behavior and public statements suggest severe emotional disturbance following her husband's death. Morrison Engineering is prepared to seek restraining orders and psychological evaluation requirements if Mrs. Williams continues to harass our personnel and make unsubstantiated claims against our company. They were already questioning my mental state 2 years before the lawyer would call me emotionally unstable. The intimidation campaign escalated quickly. 3 days after receiving the cease and desist letter, Michael discovered that someone had broken into his office. Nothing valuable was taken, computers and equipment remained untouched, but every file related to my case had been searched. Through the filing cabinet containing copies of Dr. Yamamoto's documents had been forced open. Though thankfully those papers were locked in a bank safety deposit box. This is corporate espionage, Michael told me, his face grim. They're trying to find out what evidence we have. The break-in was just the beginning. Over the next 6 months, I received 3 settlement offers, each larger than the last, but with increasingly restrictive terms. The final offer, for $250,000, came with a confidentiality agreement so broad it would have prevented me from ever mentioning David's name in connection with Fukushima, Morrison Engineering, or nuclear safety. But it was the leaked email that showed me just how far Morrison would go to protect themselves. In November 2011, a former Morrison employee named Sarah Martinez contacted Michael's office. She had quit the company in disgust after being asked to participate in what she called evidence management. The email she forwarded was dated March 15, 2011, just 4 days after the disaster. It was from Morrison's legal counsel to all department heads. Effective immediately. All documents, electronic files, communications, and records related to Fukushima operations should be reviewed for retention necessity. Materials not required for ongoing business operations should be disposed of according to standard document lifecycle protocols. In corporate speak, they were ordering the destruction of evidence. The email continued. Special attention should be paid to safety assessments, contractor evaluations, and risk analysis reports that might be misinterpreted by outside parties unfamiliar with industry standards. They weren't just covering up David's death, they were systematically destroying any evidence that could hold them accountable for the deaths of 47 people. Sarah Martinez's whistleblowing gave us legal grounds to file for an emergency injunction preventing further document destruction. But Morrison's lawyers were better funded and faster moving than our small legal team. By the time our injunction was approved, Morrison claimed that all relevant documents had already been processed according to standard retention schedules. The evidence was gone, except for Dr. Yamamoto's photocopies and Sarah's leaked email. Morrison Engineering had successfully erased their paper trail. That's when I made a decision that would define the next decade of my life. If Morrison Engineering wanted to play hardball, if they wanted to destroy evidence and question my sanity, then I would become the most methodical, persistent, and well-documented opponent they had ever faced. I bought my first digital recorder and started documenting every phone call, every meeting, every interaction with Morrison personnel. I created detailed timelines of events, cross-referenced with news reports and official statements. I began reaching out to other families of foreign workers who had died at Fukushima, slowly building a network of survivors who had been ignored by their governments and employers. Morrison Engineering had resources, lawyers, and corporate power, but they had made one critical mistake. They had underestimated a mother's determination to seek justice for her children's father. They thought they could intimidate me into silence. They were about to learn otherwise. Dr. Yamamoto's revelation that 47 foreign workers had died at Fukushima haunted me. Somewhere in the world, 46 other families were grieving just like I was, probably facing the same corporate stonewalling and government indifference. I was determined to find them. It started with internet searches in the months following my meeting with Dr. Yamamoto. I scoured international news sites, nuclear industry forums, and social media platforms for any mention of foreign casualties at Fukushima. The official reports were frustratingly vague. Most governments simply stated that their citizens had been successfully evacuated, without providing names or details. My breakthrough came through an unexpected source. In September 2011, I received an email from a woman named Claire Dubois in Lyon, France. She had seen my CNN interview posted on a nuclear safety advocacy website and recognized our parallel situations. Mrs. Williams, she wrote in careful English, I believe my husband Philippe worked with your husband at Fukushima. He was there as a consultant for Areva, the French nuclear company. Like you, I have been told conflicting stories about his death. Like you, I have been offered money to stay quiet. Perhaps we can help each other. Claire and I began corresponding daily. Philippe Dubois had been a reactor safety specialist with 20 years of experience. Like David, he had filed multiple safety complaints in the weeks before the disaster. Like David, he had refused to evacuate when the earthquake hit, staying behind to try to prevent a catastrophe. Through Claire, I met others. Maria Santos, not the CNN producer, but a widow from Barcelona whose husband Carlos had died alongside our husbands. Ingrid Larsen from Oslo, whose husband Eric had been documenting safety violations for the Norwegian Nuclear Authority. Yuki Tanaka from Tokyo, whose Australian husband James had been working for a consulting firm based in Sydney. We created a private, Facebook group called Fukushima Truth. Within 6 months, we had connected with 31 families across 15 countries. Each story was heartbreakingly similar. Foreign workers assigned to the most dangerous areas, safety concerns ignored by management, contradictory official reports, and corporate pressure to accept settlements in exchange for silence. The database we compiled became our most powerful weapon. Working together, we had names, employment records, communications, and witness testimonies for 47 foreign workers who died at Fukushima, exactly the number Dr. Yamamoto had mentioned. We had proof that governments and corporations worldwide had collaborated to hide the true scope of foreign casualties, but it was the document Claire discovered in her husband's effects that tied everything together. Felipe had been methodical about documenting safety violations, just like David. In his laptop bag, Claire found a USB drive containing what Felipe called his insurance policy, copies of safety reports, photos of dangerous conditions, and most importantly, a master list of all foreign personnel assigned to high-risk areas of the plant. The list was devastating. It showed that Morrison Engineering Areva and 3 other international firms had deliberately assigned foreign workers to the most dangerous reactor buildings while keeping their domestic employees in safer areas. The document included risk assessments that clearly identified buildings 1 and 3, where most of the foreign workers died, as having the highest probability of catastrophic failure. The companies knew their foreign employees were being sent to die. And they did it anyway because it was cheaper than properly training Japanese workers or implementing adequate safety measures. Our network shared information, legal strategies, and emotional support. Ingrid's husband had been a lawyer, so she helped us understand international jurisdiction issues. Maria's brother was a journalist who helped us get media attention in Spain. Yuki, who spoke both Japanese and English fluently, helped us communicate with Japanese activists and nuclear engineers who were sympathetic to our cause. Most importantly, we gave each other hope. When Morrison Engineering's lawyers tried to isolate me, claiming I was the only disgruntled survivor pursuing litigation, I could point to 30 other families facing identical harassment. When government officials dismissed our concerns as conspiracy theories, we had documented proof from multiple countries, showing a coordinated cover-up. The network also revealed the true scope of corporate retaliation. Claire's home had been burglarized just like Michael's office. Maria received threatening phone calls warning her to stop spreading lies about nuclear safety. Ingrid was sued by her husband's former employer for theft of proprietary information when she tried to share Eric's safety reports with Norwegian media. But perhaps the most chilling discovery came from Yuki. Her husband James had sent her regular emails during his time at Fukushima, including one dated March 10th, the day before the disaster, that read, "The bosses are getting nervous. They are talking about evacuating management personnel if the seismic activity gets worse, but they want the consultants to stay and monitor the reactors. Something doesn't feel right about this." They had advance warning. The companies had discussed evacuating their own people, while leaving the foreign consultants behind. By early 2012, our network had grown to include family members, nuclear engineers, safety advocates, and investigative journalists from around the world. We were no longer isolated, grieving widows, fighting corporate giants alone. We were an international coalition, with shared evidence, coordinated legal strategies, and growing media attention. Morrison Engineering and the other companies had tried to silence us individually. Now they were facing a unified front that spanned continents and couldn't be intimidated, bought off, or discredited. The real fight was just beginning. Armed with evidence from our international network, I made my first trip to Japan in March 2012, exactly 1 year after David's death. The Japanese government had agreed to meet with families of foreign workers, but only after months of pressure from multiple embassies and growing international media attention. The meeting was held in a sterile conference room at the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry in Tokyo. 12 of us had made the journey, widows and family members from 6 different countries, all seeking the same thing: official acknowledgement that our loved ones had died at Fukushima. The lead bureaucrat, Deputy Minister Hiroaki Sato, was polite but frustratingly evasive. Speaking through an interpreter, he expressed deep sympathy for our losses, but insisted that Japan could only provide information about Japanese nationals who had died in the disaster. But our husbands were working at Japanese facilities under Japanese safety protocols, Claire argued, her voice tight with controlled anger. How can you have no records of their presence? Sato's response was a masterclass in bureaucratic doublespeak. While we acknowledge that foreign personnel may have been present at various facilities during the earthquake and tsunami, the responsibility for tracking and reporting foreign casualties lies with their sponsoring companies and home governments. It was a perfect circle of non-accountability. The Japanese government claimed they weren't responsible for foreign workers. Our home governments claimed jurisdiction belonged to Japan. The companies claimed they were just following government protocols. The most infuriating moment came when Maria asked to see the official evacuation records from March 11th. Sato produced a thick binder labeled Foreign Personnel Evacuation Log and opened it to a page showing names, times, and evacuation vehicle assignments. Every foreign worker was listed as evacuated successfully, including our dead husbands. This says my husband Felipe was evacuated at 14:30 on March 11th, Claire said, pointing to a line in the document. But he died in the reactor building explosion at 15:36. How do you explain that? Sato consulted with his staff in rapid Japanese before responding. There may have been administrative errors in the documentation during the emergency. These records should not be considered complete or entirely accurate. So the only official records of foreign personnel at Fukushima were admittedly inaccurate, but those same records were being used to deny compensation claims and reject our requests for investigation. After 3 hours of circular logic and bureaucratic stonewalling, Sato offered what he called a gesture of goodwill. Japan would establish a memorial fund for all victims of the Fukushima incident, with contributions open to international families. But there would be no official recognition of foreign casualties, no investigation into safety violations, and no accountability for the companies involved. You're offering us charity while refusing to acknowledge our husbands existed, I told him. That's not goodwill. That's insulting. Our translator, a young woman named May, who had volunteered to help us navigate the bureaucracy, looked uncomfortable as she conveyed my words. Later, she would become an unexpected ally. The meeting ended with polite bows and empty promises to continue dialogue. As we filed out of the conference room, May slipped me a small piece of paper with her phone number and a note in English. There are Japanese people who want to help. Not everyone agrees with the government's position. That evening, May met us at our hotel and introduced us to a group of Japanese nuclear engineers, safety advocates, and families of Japanese workers who had died at Fukushima. This shadow network operated quietly, sharing information that their government preferred to keep hidden. Through them, I learned that Japan's official death toll for Fukushima was deliberately minimized, while the government claimed that no one died directly from radiation exposure. Internal documents showed that over 300 workers, both Japanese and foreign, had died from radiation-related illnesses in the months following the disaster. These deaths were officially attributed to natural causes or pre-existing conditions. Dr. Kenji Yamamoto attended one of our evening meetings, finally putting a face to the voice that had changed my life. He was smaller than I had imagined, wearing thick glasses and speaking in careful, measured sentences, but his passion for truth was unmistakable. The Japanese government is protecting TEPCO and the nuclear industry at the expense of truth. He told our group, your husbands died because safety warnings were ignored. Japanese workers died for the same reason. We are all victims of the same corporate negligence. Dr. Yamamoto gave us copies of additional documents he had acquired. TEPCO communications showing that radiation levels in reactor buildings 1 and 3 were known to be lethal hours before the explosions. Workers, including our husbands, were sent into those buildings anyway. On our last day in Tokyo, we held a press conference outside the Diet building. Japanese media gave us minimal coverage, but international reporters were interested in our story. CNN, BBC, and Reuters all interviewed us about the government's refusal to acknowledge foreign casualties. The most powerful moment came when Yuki Tanaka, whose Australian husband James had died alongside our husbands, spoke to the assembled reporters in both Japanese and English. My government tells me my husband was evacuated safely. The Australian government tells me Japan is responsible for providing information. No one will tell me how my husband died, or why. All I want is the truth. The Japanese government's response to our press conference was predictably dismissive. A foreign ministry spokesman issued a statement saying that emotional families were misunderstanding complex diplomatic and jurisdictional issues, and that Japan had provided all available information through appropriate channels. Emotional families. There was that word again, the suggestion that our grief made us irrational, unreliable, incapable of understanding the complex reasons why our husbands' deaths had to be covered up. Flying home to Portland, I realized that government bureaucracy would never give us the justice we sought. Like the corporations, they had too much invested in the official narrative to acknowledge the truth, but our trip hadn't been wasted. We had connected with allies inside Japan, gathered more evidence, and demonstrated international solidarity that couldn't be ignored. Most importantly, we had learned that the cover-up wasn't just corporate, was governmental, spanning multiple countries and involving hundreds of officials who prioritized political convenience over truth. The enemy was bigger than we had thought. But so were we. By 2013, our international network had grown strong enough to consider coordinated legal action, working with attorneys in 7 countries. We filed a class action lawsuit against Morrison Engineering, TEPCO, and 3 other international nuclear consulting firms. The case, officially titled Dubois et al. V. Morrison Engineering Corporation, ETL, represented 31 families, seeking compensation and accountability for the wrongful deaths of our loved ones. The legal challenges were staggering. The defendants were incorporated in different countries. The incident occurred in Japan, and the victims were nationals of 15 different nations. Determining jurisdiction alone took 18 months of legal maneuvering. Morrison and lawyers argued that American courts had no authority over actions taken by an American company's Japanese subsidiary. TEPCO claimed sovereign immunity as a Japanese government entity. The other firms filed motions to dismiss based on diplomatic immunity and treaty obligations. Michael Chen, my original Portland attorney, had to partner with international law firms just to navigate the procedural complexities. Our legal team eventually included attorneys in Seattle, New York, London, Paris, and Tokyo. The coordination costs were astronomical. Every document had to be translated into multiple languages. Every motion required approval from lawyers in different jurisdictions, and every court appearance involved complex video conferencing with attorneys scattered across time zones. The discovery phase began in late 2014 and became a war of attrition. We requested all documents related to safety assessments, personnel, assignments, evacuation procedures, and communications between the companies and government officials. The defendants responded with motions to limit discovery, claims of proprietary information, and assertions of executive privilege. Morrison Engineering alone produced 847,000 pages of documents, but most were heavily redacted or completely irrelevant. We received hundreds of pages that were entirely blacked out except for headers and page numbers. One particularly ridiculous submission included 200 pages of Morrison's employee cafeteria menus from 2010 to 2011. Apparently provided to meet the court's requirement for comprehensive document production. The depositions were even more frustrating. James Morrison, the CEO who had called me on the night David died, claimed he couldn't recall the conversation. When pressed about his company's contradictory public statements, he cited attorney-client privilege and corporate confidentiality agreements. His deposition lasted 6 days and produced virtually no useful information. TEPCO executives were even less forthcoming. They testified through interpreters and frequently claimed that questions about safety procedures were too technical for known engineers to understand. When shown internal documents discussing acceptable loss parameters, they insisted the terminology had been mistranslated and actually referred to equipment failure rates, not human casualties. The emotional toll on our families was devastating. Emma, now in middle school, began having anxiety attacks during the periods when I had to travel for depositions or court hearings. Michael, struggling through his teenage years without a father, began acting out at school and getting into fights with classmates who made jokes about nuclear families. The financial strain was equally brutal. Even with our attorneys working on contingency, the costs of international litigation were staggering. Expert witness fees alone exceeded $300,000. We needed nuclear engineers, safety specialists, radiation, health experts, and international law scholars to build our case. Travel costs for depositions and court appearances across multiple countries added another $150,000. I had to take out a second mortgage on our house and exhaust David's 401k just to keep the case moving forward. But the most heartbreaking challenge was watching our coalition fracture under the pressure. 3 families accepted settlement offers and withdrew from the lawsuit after their attorneys advised them that the legal costs would eventually exceed any potential recovery. Maria Santos' family in Barcelona faced threats from unknown sources and decided the risk wasn't worth continuing. 2 other families simply ran out of money and couldn't afford to continue their participation. By 2016, our plaintiff group had shrunk from 31 families to 18. The defendants used our reduced numbers to argue that most affected families had been adequately compensated and that the remaining plaintiffs were pursuing frivolous litigation for financial gain. The breakthrough came in early 2017 when a former TEPCO engineer named Hiroshi Nakamura came forward with internal documents that had been hidden during discovery. Nakamura had been diagnosed with terminal cancer and decided to clear his conscience before he died. The documents he provided showed that TEPCO executives had known about critical safety failures at Fukushima for over a year before the disaster but had delayed repairs to avoid shutting down profitable reactor operations. More importantly, Nakamura's documents included detailed communications between TEPCO and Morrison Engineering showing that both companies had agreed to use foreign workers as expendable personnel for high-risk operations. An email chain from February 2011 explicitly discussed minimizing domestic casualty exposure by utilizing international contractor personnel for Category 5 risk operations. Category 5 risk operations, according to TEPCO's own safety manual, were defined as activities with high probability of personnel fatality in emergency scenarios. With Nakamura's evidence, our case suddenly had the smoking gun we needed. Morrison Engineering and TEPCO had conspired to use our husbands as sacrificial workers, knowing they would likely die if anything went wrong. The defendants' response was swift and vicious. They claimed Nakamura's documents were fabricated, that his cancer had affected his judgment, and that his deathbed accusations were an attempt to blame others for Japan's national tragedy. Morrison Engineering's lawyers filed motions asking the court to exclude Nakamura's testimony as unreliable and inflammatory. But we also faced pressure from unexpected sources. The U.S. State Department filed an amicus brief supporting Morrison Engineering's position, arguing that the lawsuit could damage important diplomatic relationships and interfere with ongoing nuclear cooperation agreements between the United States and Japan. Our own government was siding with the corporation that had killed my husband. By 2018, 7 years after David's death, we had spent over $2 million in legal fees and were facing mounting pressure to settle. The defendants offered a collective settlement of $15 million to be divided among the remaining 18 families, less than $850,000 each, before legal fees. But the settlement came with the same restrictions we had been fighting all along: complete confidentiality, admission of no wrongdoing by the defendants, and a requirement that we publicly state that our legal action had been resolved to everyone's satisfaction. They wanted to buy our silence one final time. Standing in the Seattle courthouse where our case had been consolidated, surrounded by lawyers who had worked for 7 years on our behalf, I faced the most difficult decision of my life: take the money and finally provide financial security for Emma and Michael, or continue fighting for accountability and risk losing everything. The settlement offer came with a deadline. We had 30 days to decide whether to accept the $15 million or continue litigation that could drag on for years with no guarantee of success. While our legal team debated strategy, I decided to take our case directly to the public through the media. My first call was to 60 Minutes. I had been contacted by their producers twice over the years, but the legal complexities and international jurisdiction issues had made our story difficult to tell in a television format. Now, with Nakamura's explosive documents and the settlement deadline looming, they were interested again. Producer Janet Walsh flew to Portland to interview me in February 2018. We spent 3 days going through documents, reviewing and filming segments about David's death and our 7-year legal battle. Janet was thorough and skeptical, exactly what I wanted in a journalist. She fact-checked every claim, demanded documentation for every allegation, and conducted separate interviews with Michael Chen, Dr. Yamamoto, and Claire Dubois. The interview process was emotionally exhausting but cathartic. For the first time since David's death, I was able to tell our complete story to someone with the platform and resources to investigate independently. Janet's team spent weeks verifying documents, interviewing nuclear experts, and researching the corporate relationships between Morrison Engineering, TEPCO, and the Japanese government. 3 weeks before the scheduled air date, Janet called me with devastating news. "Rachel, I'm sorry, but 60 Minutes has decided not to run your story." "Why? What changed?" "Legal pressure." Morrison attorneys contacted CBS executives directly, threatening massive defamation lawsuits if we broadcast any segments containing unsubstantiated allegations about their company. The network decided the legal risk was too high. I was stunned. "But you verified everything. You checked the documents." "I know, and I believe your story. But corporate lawyers are worried about a multi-billion-dollar company with unlimited legal resources coming after CBS. They don't want to fight that battle." Janet was clearly frustrated, but she had been overruled by network executives who prioritized legal safety over journalistic integrity. The 60 Minutes segment that could have exposed the truth about Fukushima to millions of Americans would never air. But Janet offered me something valuable. "I can't broadcast your story on 60 Minutes, but I know independent journalists who might be interested. And Rachel, keep copies of everything we discussed. This story needs to be told." She connected me with a freelance investigative team led by former Washington Post reporter Daniel Kim. Daniel and his colleagues had been investigating corporate malfeasance in the nuclear industry for years and weren't intimidated by legal threats from Morrison Engineering. Working with a shoestring budget and crowd-funded support, Daniel's team produced a documentary called The Fukushima Files: Foreign Workers Forgotten. The film premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in January 2019 and won the Documentary Jury Prize for Investigative Excellence. The documentary was devastating to our opponents. Using Nakamura's documents, Dr. Yamamoto's evidence, and interviews with families from 6 countries, the film methodically dismantled the official narrative about Fukushima. It showed how Morrison Engineering and other international firms had deliberately used foreign workers as expendable labor, how governments had collaborated to hide casualty numbers, and how corporate legal teams had systematically silenced grieving families. Morrison Engineering's response was predictably aggressive. They hired a public relations firm to launch a counter-campaign, claiming the documentary contained factual errors and emotional manipulation. They created a website called FukushimaFacts.org that portrayed our international coalition as conspiracy theorists, exploiting a national tragedy for financial gain. But the documentary had an impact that traditional media coverage couldn't achieve. It was shared thousands of times on social media, screened at film festivals worldwide, and eventually picked up by streaming services in 12 countries. For the first time, our story was reaching audiences that corporate lawyers couldn't silence. The film also inspired other journalists to investigate similar cover-ups in the nuclear industry. The Guardian published a series on foreign worker safety at nuclear facilities worldwide. Der Spiegel investigated German companies' relationships with TEPCO. Le Monde examined Arev's role in the Fukushima disaster and its treatment of French workers. Families. Social media became our most powerful weapon against corporate censorship. We created Facebook pages, Twitter accounts, and YouTube channels that couldn't be controlled by network executives worried about defamation suits. Emma, now in high school, helped me understand how to use platforms like Instagram and TikTok to reach younger audiences who were passionate about corporate accountability and social justice. The hashtag Fukushima Forgotten began trending internationally, with posts sharing stories of the 47 foreign workers who had died but been erased from official records. Nuclear safety advocates, environmental activists, and social justice organizations amplified our message to audiences that traditional media had failed to reach. But our media success came at a personal cost. Morrison Engineering's public relations counterattack included attempts to discredit me personally. Anonymous websites appeared claiming I was mentally unstable, that I was exploiting my husband's death for financial gain, and that I had fabricated evidence to support false accusations. The attacks extended to my children. Emma's social media accounts were flooded with harassment from fake accounts, questioning her father's heroism and her mother's sanity. Michael was confronted at school by classmates who had seen online posts claiming David was actually a corporate saboteur who had caused the Fukushima disaster. The psychological warfare was sophisticated and relentless. Someone had clearly studied our family and crafted attacks designed to isolate us from our community and undermine our credibility. It was a level of corporate retaliation that went far beyond normal legal tactics. But the strategy backfired. The obvious coordination and viciousness of the attacks actually validated our claims about corporate misconduct. Journalists began investigating the public relations campaign against us, tracing funding back to shell companies connected to Morrison Engineering, and other nuclear industry players. By late 2019, our media battle had evolved into something larger than our specific case. We had become symbols of ordinary families fighting corporate power, of truth versus propaganda, of justice versus profit. The story was no longer just about David's death at Fukushima. It was about whether corporations could silence inconvenient truths through legal intimidation and public relations manipulation, and increasingly, the answer was no. The hardest part of fighting for justice wasn't the corporate lawyers, the government bureaucrats, or even the financial strain. It was watching my children grow up in the shadow of their father's death and my relentless pursuit of accountability. By 2019, Emma was 18 and preparing for college, while Michael was 16 and struggling through high school. Both had spent their formative years with a mother who was either traveling for depositions, locked in her home office reviewing legal documents, or emotionally drained from the constant battle. Emma bore the brunt of my distraction during her crucial middle school years. While other mothers were helping with homework and attending school events, I was often on the phone with lawyers or preparing for media interviews. Emma learned to make her own dinner, do her own laundry, and handle parent-teacher conferences when I was out of town for legal proceedings. The breaking point came during Emma's junior year when her school counselor, Mrs. Patterson, called me for a mandatory meeting. Emma had been selected for early admission to Stanford University, but her grades had suddenly plummeted in the final semester. She was skipping classes, isolating herself from friends, and showing signs of severe anxiety. Mrs. Williams, Mrs. Patterson said gently. Emma wrote an essay for her English class about growing up as the daughter of a professional victim. She's clearly struggling with the constant attention your case receives, and the way it's defined her identity throughout high school. The essay, which Mrs. Patterson shared with Emma's permission, was heartbreaking. Emma wrote about classmates who knew her only as the Fukushima girl, about family dinners dominated by discussions of legal strategy, about feeling guilty for wanting a normal teenage life while her father's memory demanded justice. I love my dad and I'm proud of my mom, Emma had written, but sometimes I wish we could just be a regular family that talks about movies and school and stupid teenage drama instead of radiation exposure and corporate conspiracy theories. I feel selfish for wanting that, but I also feel like I never had a choice about becoming an activist for nuclear safety. It was decided for me when I was 4 years old. Reading Emma's words, I realized I had been so focused on honoring David's memory that I had failed to protect our children's childhood. My fight for justice had consumed not just my life, but theirs as well. Michael's struggles were different but equally concerning. At 16, he had developed an explosive temper and was getting into fights at school with classmates who made jokes about nuclear disasters or crazy conspiracy theory families. He had been suspended twice for physical altercations and was seeing a therapist for anger management. During one particularly difficult family meeting with Michael's therapist, Dr. Sarah Kim, Michael finally expressed years of suppressed resentment. "Mom, I know you're trying to get justice for Dad, but he's been dead for 8 years. I barely remember him. What I remember is you crying all the time, and lawyers calling during dinner, and having to explain to everyone why my family is always in the news. I thought I was fighting for you and Emma," I told him, tears streaming down my face. "I thought I was making sure your father's sacrifice meant something. But what about our sacrifice?" Michael shot back. "What about the fact that Emma and I gave up having a normal mom so you could fight Morrison Engineering? What about the fact that we've been dealing with online harassment and weird looks from neighbors for our entire lives because of your crusade?" Dr. Kim helped us work through these painful conversations over several months. She explained that my children had experienced a form of secondary trauma, not just from losing their father, but from living with a mother whose grief had transformed into an all-consuming mission that left little room for their emotional needs. The financial strain had also taken its toll on our family dynamics. We had moved to a smaller apartment to afford legal costs, which meant Emma and Michael had to share a bedroom throughout high school. Emma couldn't participate in expensive extracurricular activities like debate team travel or advanced art classes. Michael had to get a part-time job at 16 to help with household expenses, while his friends were focused on academics and sports. Most painfully, both children had absorbed my anger and suspicion toward institutions. Emma was brilliant and could have thrived in student government or journalism, but she was deeply cynical about authority figures and corporate power. Michael was naturally gifted at science and engineering just like his father, but he refused to consider nuclear engineering as a career path because of the associations with our family trauma. The turning point came when Emma was completing her college applications. She had written her personal statement about growing up in the shadow of Fukushima, about watching her mother fight for justice, about the cost of pursuing truth in the face of corporate power. It was a powerful essay, but it defined her entirely in relation to her father's death and my activism. "Mom," she told me one evening as we sat in our small kitchen, "I want to study art history and maybe become a museum curator. I want to do something beautiful with my life, something that has nothing to do with nuclear disasters or corporate lawsuits. Is that okay with you?" The question broke my heart because I realized Emma felt she needed my permission to pursue her own dreams instead of carrying forward my mission. I had inadvertently created an expectation that our children's lives should be dedicated to honoring their father's memory through activism and legal battles. "Emma, your father would want you to be happy," I told her. "He would want you to create your own life, not live in the shadow of his death. I'm sorry if I made you feel otherwise." Michael's path to healing was more complicated. His anger was deeply rooted in feeling abandoned first by his father's death, then by my emotional unavailability during his childhood. But gradually, through family therapy and honest conversations, he began to understand that my fight wasn't just about the past, but about preventing other families from experiencing what we had endured. "I still think you could have handled things differently," he told me during one of our therapy sessions. "But I also understand why you couldn't just let them cover up Dad's death. Maybe when I'm older, I'll be proud of what you did. Right now, I'm just tired of it all." By Emma's high school graduation in 2020, our family had reached a fragile equilibrium. Emma would attend Stanford on a partial scholarship, pursuing her dream of art history while understanding that her father's legacy had helped shape her sense of justice and integrity. Michael was planning to study environmental engineering, finding his own way to honor his father's commitment to safety while pursuing his own interests. The cost of my 13-year battle had been enormous, not financially, but emotionally and relationally. My children had paid a price for my pursuit of justice that I was only beginning to understand. But they had also developed resilience, integrity, and a deep understanding of right and wrong that would serve them throughout their lives. As Emma packed for college, she hugged me tightly and whispered, "Mom, I hope you get the justice you've been fighting for, but I also hope you can find some peace when this is all over. You deserve to be happy too." Her words reminded me that justice wasn't just about holding corporations accountable for David's death. It was also about healing our family and building a future where Emma and Michael could thrive on their own terms, carrying their father's memory without being defined by the circumstances of his loss. The breakthrough that would finally crack our case wide open came from the most unexpected source imaginable. In March 2020, exactly 9 years after David's death, I received a FedEx package with no return address. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note in shaky English, "Mrs. Williams. My name is Takeshi Sato. I was assistant to Deputy Minister Hiroaki Sato during Fukushima crisis. My conscience cannot bear the truth anymore. These documents will prove what you have been saying. I am dying of cancer and must clear my soul before I meet my ancestors." The USB drive contained over 3,000 internal government documents that had never been released publicly, but it was one specific file that changed everything. A TEPCO internal memo dated February 28, 2011, just 11 days before the disaster, with the subject line, "Acceptable loss parameters for international contractor operations." The memo was a cold, calculating analysis of cost-benefit ratios for different worker safety scenarios. It compared the financial cost of implementing additional safety measures against the acceptable loss parameters for different categories of workers. The document broke down personnel into 3 categories: domestic critical staff, Japanese TEPCO employees; domestic expendable staff, Japanese contractors; and international expendable staff, foreign workers. The analysis was chilling in its clinical detachment. According to TEPCO's calculations, enhanced safety measures for international expendable staff were not cost-justified because compensation for foreign worker casualties would be significantly lower than domestic worker compensation due to jurisdictional limitations and reduced legal liability exposure. In plain English, TEPCO had determined that it was cheaper to let foreign workers die than to implement proper safety measures, because they calculated that families like mine would have limited ability to sue for damages. The memo included specific projections for different disaster scenarios, including a Category 4 reactor incident that matched exactly what occurred on March 11. In this scenario, TEPCO projected that foreign workers assigned to high-risk containment operations had a 73% probability of terminal exposure, but that the resulting legal and compensation costs would be manageable within existing corporate insurance frameworks. They had known our husbands would probably die, and they had decided it was an acceptable business expense. But the document that truly devastated our opponents was an email chain between TEPCO executives and Morrison Engineering Management, copied 2 officials at 3 other international consulting firms. The emails, dated March 3 to 9, 2011, discussed specific worker assignments for the anticipated seismic event response protocols. James Morrison, the CEO who had called me the night David died, had personally approved the assignment of foreign workers to what the emails called Category 5 risk operations in reactor buildings 1 and 3. The email chain included his direct response: understood. International staff expendability acceptable for critical operations. Domestic staff safety priority confirmed. Morrison had personally signed David's death warrant. The emails also revealed the coordination between companies and government officials to conceal foreign casualties. 3 days after the disaster, there was a conference call between TEPCO Morrison Engineering Areva and representatives from the Japanese Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry. The call summary, written by Takeshi Sato himself, documented their agreement to minimize international incident impact through coordinated information management and casualty reporting protocols. They had planned the cover-up while our husbands' bodies were still radioactive in the reactor buildings. Armed with this explosive evidence, our legal team filed an emergency motion to reopen discovery and include the new documents in our case. Morrison Engineering's response was swift and desperate. They claimed the documents were fabricated, that Takeshi Sato was mentally incompetent due to his illness, and that the USB drive had been planted by foreign agents trying to damage U.S.-Japan relations. But their protests rang hollow when independent forensic analysis confirmed the authenticity of the documents. The metadata showed creation dates, modification histories, and digital signatures that matched TEPCO and Morrison Engineering's own internal systems. More importantly, details in the documents matched classified information that only executives and government officials could have accessed. Dr. Yamamoto, our original whistleblower, was able to verify many of the technical details in the memos against his own knowledge of Fukushima's operations. Nuclear safety experts confirmed that the Category 5 risk operations, described in the emails, were indeed the specific tasks that our husbands had been performing when they died. The revelation transformed our legal position overnight. We were no longer grieving families, making accusations based on circumstantial evidence. We had smoking gun proof that Morrison Engineering, TEPCO, and government officials had conspired to use foreign workers as expendable labor and then covered up their deaths to avoid accountability. International media coverage exploded. When we released carefully redacted portions of the documents, the New York Times published a front-page story titled, "Nuclear Companies Calculated Foreign Worker Deaths as Acceptable Losses." The BBC produced a documentary special called The Fukushima Conspiracy: How Governments and Corporations Hid the Truth. CNN, which had first covered my story 9 years earlier, dedicated an entire primetime special to the new revelations. Morrison Engineering's stock price plummeted 34% in the 3 days following the story's publication. TEPCO faced calls for criminal investigation from multiple governments. The Japanese Diet announced hearings into government officials' roles in the cover up. But the personal vindication was even more powerful than the media coverage. For 9 years, Morrison Engineering's lawyers had portrayed me as an emotionally unstable widow whose grief had led her to fabricate conspiracy theories about corporate misconduct. Now we had documentary proof that every accusation I had made was not only true, but actually understated the scope of the conspiracy. The settlement offers began almost immediately. Morrison Engineering's lead attorney called Michael Chen just 3 days after the documents became public, offering $50 million for our case alone, 5 times their previous offer to our entire coalition. TEPCO's representatives reached out through diplomatic channels, suggesting a comprehensive resolution that could include substantial compensation and safety reform measures. But we also faced new dangers. Takeshi Sato, the brave government official who had provided the documents, died of cancer just 2 weeks after sending me the USB drive. His death was officially attributed to his illness, but the timing was suspiciously convenient for those who wanted to prevent further revelations. More troubling, our legal team began receiving subtle threats. Michael Chen's office was broken into again, though nothing was stolen. Claire Dubois reported being followed by unknown individuals while walking in Lyon. Dr. Yamamoto called to warn us that Japanese authorities had questioned him about his relationship with foreign agitators. The corporations and government officials exposed by Takeshi Sato's documents were growing desperate. They had spent 9 years successfully covering up one of the worst corporate crimes in modern history, and now their carefully constructed lies were crumbling. But Takeshi Sato had given us more than just evidence. He had given us the truth that David and the other 46 foreign workers deserved. Their deaths hadn't been accidents or unavoidable casualties of a natural disaster. They had been calculated business decisions made by executives who valued profit over human life. Now, we had the proof to make them pay for it. With Takeshi Sato's documents exposing the conspiracy, Morrison Engineering was in full damage control mode. Just 1 week after the story broke internationally, I received a call from their lead attorney, Richard Preston himself, the senior partner at Preston and Associates, who had previously only communicated through subordinates. Mrs. Williams, his voice was carefully measured, professional, but with an undertone of urgency. I think it's time we had a serious conversation about resolving this matter in a way that serves everyone's interests. The settlement offer they presented was staggering, $2 million for my family alone, plus an additional $500,000 for Emma and Michael's college expenses. Combined with similar offers to the other families in our coalition, Morrison Engineering was prepared to pay out over $30 million to make our case disappear. But it was the non-monetary terms that revealed their true desperation. The proposed settlement agreement was 47 pages of legal language designed to ensure that the truth about Fukushima would never see the light of day. We would be required to return all documents obtained through discovery and destroy any copies, agree never to discuss Morrison Engineering's role in Fukushima with media, researchers, or government investigators, publicly state that our legal action had been resolved satisfactorily, with no admission of wrongdoing by any party, submit to periodic compliance monitoring, to ensure we weren't violating the confidentiality agreement, pay financial penalties of up to $5 million if we were found to have disclosed any information covered by the settlement most insidiously. The agreement included a clause requiring us to cooperate with Morrison Engineering's public relations efforts to correct misinformation about the Fukushima incident. In effect, they wanted us to become spokespersons for their version of events, actively helping them discredit other survivors or investigators who might challenge their narrative. Michael Chen was conflicted about the offer. After 9 years of brutal litigation, he was exhausted and concerned about the mounting legal costs. Rachel, this is generational wealth for your family. Emma and Michael would never have to worry about money. You could finally have financial security. But my attorney in France, Claire's lawyer, Jean-Baptiste Moreau, was more skeptical. This is not a settlement, he told me during a video conference with our international legal team. This is an attempt to purchase the truth. They are offering money in exchange for becoming accomplices in covering up corporate murder. The pressure to accept came from unexpected sources. Emma, now in her freshman year at Stanford, called me crying after learning about the offer. Mom, I know this is about principle, but $2.5 million would change our lives. I could graduate without student loans. Michael could go to any college he wants. You could finally stop working 3 jobs just to pay for legal fees. Even more difficult was the pressure from some of the other families in our coalition. 3 families had already indicated they would accept Morrison Engineering's offers. Maria Santos called me from Barcelona. her voice heavy with exhaustion. Rachel, I have spent 9 years of my life fighting these people. I am 54 years old, I have no savings, and my daughter needs money for medical school. Maybe it's time to accept that we've accomplished what we can, but it was a conversation with Dr. Yamamoto that crystallized my decision. He called me just days before the settlement deadline, his voice urgent. Mrs. Williams, if you accept this settlement, Morrison Engineering will use it as proof that their version of events is correct. They will tell future investigators that the families accepted their explanation and compensation. Your silence will be used to cover up not just what happened to your husband, but what happens to future workers in similar situations. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Morrison Engineering couldn't prove they were innocent, so they were trying to buy evidence of our satisfaction with their behavior. Our signatures on a settlement agreement would become their most powerful defense against future accountability. I called a family meeting with Emma and Michael. We sat in our small kitchen, the same room where I had received the call about David's death 9 years earlier. I laid out the choice we faced. I know this money would change our lives, I told them. But accepting it means agreeing that your father's death was just an acceptable business cost. It means helping Morrison Engineering hide the truth about what they did to 47 people. It means other families in the future might face the same betrayal because we were too tired or too greedy to hold these companies accountable. Michael, now 17 and more mature than his years, surprised me with his response. Mom, I've been angry at you for years for choosing this fight over our family. But if we take their money now, after everything we've learned, then Dad really did die for nothing. At least if we keep fighting, his death might prevent other people from being killed. Emma was more conflicted. I understand the principle, Mom, but I'm also scared about our future. What if we turn down this money and then lose the case? What if we end up with nothing after 13 years of fighting? It was a valid fear. Despite our strong evidence, there were no guarantees in litigation this complex. Morrison Engineering had unlimited resources and would appeal any adverse verdict for years. We could win at trial and still be fighting appeals when Emma and Michael had children of their own. The decision ultimately came down to a simple question. What would David want us to do? David had dedicated his career to nuclear safety because he believed that human life was more important than corporate profit. He had stayed at Fukushima during the disaster because he thought he could prevent other people from being hurt. He had died trying to do the right thing, even when it was dangerous. Taking Morrison Engineering's money in exchange for covering up their crimes would be a betrayal of everything David had lived and died for. I called Richard Preston and delivered my answer. Mr. Preston, tell your clients that David Williams' family is not for sale. We reject your settlement offer, and we'll see you in court. His response was immediate and chilling. Mrs. Williams, you're making a serious mistake. My clients have been more than generous. If you reject this offer, they will have no choice but to pursue more aggressive defensive strategies. Is that a threat, Mr. Preston? It's a prediction, Mrs. Williams. You've chosen to make this a fight to the finish. I hope you understand what that means. I was about to find out. Morrison Engineering's aggressive defensive strategies began just 3 days after I rejected their settlement offer. Richard Preston filed a motion requesting a court-ordered psychiatric evaluation, claiming that my increasingly erratic behavior and rejection of reasonable settlement offers indicated severe emotional disturbance that compromises her ability to make rational legal decisions. The motion was a masterclass in character assassination disguised as legal procedure. It cited my obsessive documentation of our case, my paranoid accusations against Morrison Engineering, and my irrational refusal of their generous compensation offer as evidence of mental instability. The filing even included quotes from anonymous Morrison employees claiming I had made threatening statements during phone calls and displayed unhinged behavior during depositions. This is beyond the pale, Michael Chen told me, his voice shaking with anger as he read through the motion. They're trying to claim that seeking justice for your husband's death is evidence of mental illness. It's disgusting, but it's also legally dangerous. The strategy was more sophisticated than simple mudslinging. If Morrison Engineering could convince the court that I was mentally incompetent, they could potentially invalidate my entire legal case. Under Oregon law, someone determined to be psychologically incapable of making rational decisions couldn't serve as a representative plaintiff in a class action lawsuit. More insidiously, the psychiatric evaluation would become public record, even if the evaluation concluded I was perfectly sane. The mere fact that my mental state had been questioned would follow me forever. Future employers, potential romantic partners, even college admissions officers, reviewing Emma and Michael's applications, would be able to find court documents questioning my psychological fitness. The hearing on Morrison's motion was scheduled for May 15, 2020, a date I'll never forget, because it fell on Michael's 17th birthday. Instead of celebrating with my son, I spent the day in a Seattle courtroom, defending my sanity against a team of corporate lawyers who had been trying to destroy my life for 9 years. Richard Preston's presentation was smooth and persuasive. He painted a picture of a grief-stricken widow who had become so consumed with blame and conspiracy theories that she could no longer distinguish between reality and paranoid fantasy. Your Honor, Preston argued, Mrs. Williams has spent nearly a decade pursuing increasingly fantastic allegations against my client. She has rejected multiple reasonable settlement offers, including one that would have provided her family with financial security for generations. She continues to make public statements claiming an international conspiracy involving multiple governments and corporations. Despite the lack of credible evidence supporting these claims, I wanted to scream that we had documented evidence of exactly such a conspiracy. But my own attorney had warned me to remain silent during Preston's presentation. Preston continued, most concerning, Mrs. Williams has become obsessed with what she calls justice for the 47, referring to her belief that dozens of foreign workers died at Fukushima despite official records showing successful evacuations. This fixation has consumed her life and, according to family friends, has negatively impacted her relationship with her children. The family friends Preston cited were never named, and I suspected they didn't exist. But the strategy was effective. He was using my dedication to uncovering the truth as evidence of obsessive behavior, and my commitment to honoring David's memory as proof of unhealthy fixation. Judge Patricia Wang listened impassively as Preston requested that I undergo a comprehensive psychological evaluation by a court-appointed psychiatrist. Given the substantial settlement amounts at stake and the international implications of this case, Preston concluded, the court has a responsibility to ensure that Mrs. Williams is capable of making rational decisions in the best interests of her family and the other plaintiffs she represents. When it was Michael Chen's turn to respond, he was furious but controlled. Your Honor, Morrison Engineering is attempting to weaponize mental health stigma to silence a woman who has uncovered evidence of their criminal negligence. Mrs. Williams has spent 9 years methodically building a case based on documented evidence, not conspiracy theories. The fact that she won't accept hush money to cover up corporate crimes isn't evidence of mental illness, it's evidence of moral courage. Michael presented our counter-evidence. My years of successful parenting, my ability to manage complex litigation across multiple jurisdictions, my articulate media interviews, and my coherent legal strategy. He pointed out that Morrison Engineering had never questioned my mental state until I rejected their settlement offer, suggesting their concern was tactical rather than genuine. Most importantly, Your Honor, Michael concluded, the documents Mrs. Williams has uncovered proving Morrison Engineering's conspiracy have been independently verified by forensic experts and corroborated by multiple sources. These aren't the fantasies of a disturbed mind, they're the discoveries of a determined investigator who refused to accept corporate lies. Judge Wong took 2 weeks to issue her ruling. During that time, I lived in a state of constant anxiety, knowing that my entire case on my reputation hung in the balance. Emma called me every day from Stanford, worried that her mother might be declared legally insane. Michael, typically direct, asked me, Mom, what happens if they say you're crazy? Do we lose everything? The court's decision came in a written order that I've read hundreds of times since. The court finds that Morrison Engineering's motion for psychiatric evaluation is not supported by credible evidence of plaintiff's mental incapacity. Mrs. Williams' pursuit of legal remedies for her husband's death, even in the face of corporate pressure and substantial settlement offers, does not constitute evidence of mental illness. Indeed, her methodical approach to building her case and her ability to articulate complex legal and factual issues suggest clear cognitive function and rational decision-making. But it was Judge Wong's final paragraph that truly vindicated me. The court notes with concern Morrison Engineering's apparent strategy of questioning plaintiff's mental state only after she rejected their settlement offer Such tactics, which attempt to pathologize legitimate grieving and advocacy, are inconsistent with principles of justice and basic human dignity. I cried when I read those words, not just from relief, but from gratitude that someone in authority had finally recognized what Morrison Engineering was doing to me and my family. The psychiatric evaluation they had demanded was assigned to Dr. Elizabeth Peterson, a forensic psychologist with 30 years of experience. Her assessment, conducted over 3 sessions, concluded that I was psychologically resilient, cognitively intact, and demonstrating appropriate emotional responses. 2 extraordinary circumstances. Dr. Peterson's report actually strengthened our case. Mrs. Williams presents as an individual who has channeled legitimate grief into purposeful action. Her detailed documentation, strategic thinking, and ability to maintain family relationships while pursuing complex litigation demonstrate exceptional psychological strength rather than mental illness. But the damage was done. Morrison Engineering had succeeded in forcing me to undergo psychiatric evaluation, creating a public record of questions about my mental state. Even though I was vindicated, the mere existence of the proceedings would be used to undermine my credibility for years to come. More importantly, the emotionally unstable label that their lawyer had used became their standard response to media inquiries about our case. Whenever journalists asked Morrison Engineering to comment on our allegations, their spokesperson would refer to me as a disturbed individual whose mental state has been questioned by the courts. It was a lie the court had explicitly rejected their claims about my mental state, but it was a lie that served their purposes. They had weaponized mental health stigma to discredit a woman who threatened their carefully constructed narrative. The attack on my sanity was Morrison Engineering's most desperate and vicious strategy yet, but it was also a sign that they were running out of options. After 9 years of lies, intimidation, and cover-ups, they had been reduced to claiming that seeking justice for my husband's death was evidence of mental illness. They had revealed more about their own moral bankruptcy than they had about my psychological state. After surviving Morrison Engineering's attempt to have me declared mentally incompetent, I made a decision that would prove crucial to our ultimate victory. If they wanted to question my sanity, I would demonstrate just how methodical and rational my approach had been over the past 9 years. It was time to reveal the full scope of what I had been quietly gathering while they dismissed me. As an emotionally unstable widow, in my home office, the same room where David used to review nuclear safety protocols, I had built what I called my evidence vault. What started as a few manila folders in 2011 had grown into a sophisticated documentation system spanning 13 filing cabinets, 3 computers, and over 50,000 individual pieces of evidence. Every phone call with Morrison Engineering since 2012 had been recorded using a digital recorder I bought after their first settlement offer. Oregon's one-party consent law meant I could legally record conversations without informing the other party, and I had captured over 200 hours of Morrison executives, lawyers, and public relations representatives making contradictory statements about David's death. The recordings were devastating. In one particularly damning conversation from 2016, Morrison's head of legal affairs, Patricia Chen, admitted to a colleague, not knowing I was on the line during a conference call, that the Williams woman is actually right about most of the facts, but we can't afford to let her prove it in court. I had also systematically collected and preserved every piece of physical evidence related to David's death. His laptop, returned by Morrison Engineering 3 months after the disaster, contained deleted files that computer forensics experts had recovered. These files included David's own safety reports, photos of dangerous conditions at Fukushima, and email correspondence with other foreign workers expressing concerns about reactor safety. One email, sent by David to his Morrison Engineering supervisor just 2 days before the earthquake, read, "The cooling system vulnerabilities we identified last week are getting worse, not better. TEPCO is prioritizing reactor output over safety protocols. If we have another seismic event like the one in 2010, this plant is going to become a tomb for everyone working here." His supervisor's response was equally chilling. "David, your job is to monitor and report, not to make policy recommendations. TEPCO's operational decisions are not your concern. Focus on your assigned safety assessments and let management handle the big picture." Morrison Engineering had known exactly what David was worried about, and they had ordered him to ignore those concerns. But the crown jewel of my evidence vault was what I called the conspiracy timeline, a detailed chronological documentation of every lie, contradiction, and cover-up attempt by Morrison Engineering, TEPCO, and government officials from March 11, 2011, through the present day. The timeline included 847 specific instances where official statements contradicted documented facts. It showed how Morrison Engineering's story about David's death had changed 17 times over 9 years, each version designed to minimize their liability or deflect blame onto other parties. Most importantly, the timeline demonstrated the coordination between Morrison Engineering and government officials to suppress information about foreign casualties, using dates, times, and communication records. I had mapped out a systematic campaign to erase 47 people from the historical record of Fukushima. I had also developed relationships with sources inside the nuclear industry who provided me with information that never appeared in official reports. Sarah Martinez, the former Morrison employee who had leaked the document destruction order, had introduced me to a network of nuclear engineers and safety specialists who were appalled by their industry's handling of Fukushima. Through these sources, I learned that Morrison Engineering's negligence at Fukushima wasn't an isolated incident. They had a pattern of cutting safety corners on international projects where regulatory oversight was minimal and legal liability was limited. Internal company documents obtained through my sources showed similar acceptable loss calculations for projects in Kazakhstan, India, and Brazil. David hadn't just died because of one company's greed. He had died because of an entire industry's systematic devaluation of foreign workers' lives. The evidence vault also contained detailed financial records showing the true cost of Morrison Engineering's cover-up. Over 9 years, they had spent an estimated $73 million on legal fees, public relations campaigns, lobbying efforts, and settlement payments to silence other survivors. They could have implemented the safety measures that would have saved David and the other 46 workers for less than $12 million. They had chosen to spend 6 times more money covering up deaths than preventing them. Perhaps most powerfully, I had compiled testimony from the families of all 47 foreign workers who died at Fukushima. Working with our international network, we had documented each person's story, their backgrounds, their concerns about safety, their final communications with family members, and the lies their families were told about their deaths. These weren't statistics or casualty figures. They were human beings with names, faces, and families who loved them. David Williams, Felipe Dubois, Carla Santos, Eric Larson, James Tenekich had been someone's husband, father, son, or brother. Each had died trying to prevent a nuclear catastrophe. Each had been erased from history to protect corporate profits. The evidence vault represented more than just documentation of corporate crimes. It was a testament to what an ordinary person could accomplish through patience, persistence, and methodical investigation. Morrison Engineering's lawyers had tried to portray me as an unhinged conspiracy theorist, but my evidence vault demonstrated the opposite: systematic, rational analysis that had uncovered the truth through careful documentation and verification. When Michael Chen saw the full scope of my evidence collection for the first time, he was stunned. "Rachel, this isn't just a legal case file. This is one of the most comprehensive investigations of corporate negligence I've ever seen. You've basically conducted a 9-year criminal investigation without any official authority or resources." But it was Emma's reaction that meant the most to me. Home from Stanford for winter break, she spent hours going through the evidence vault, reading David's emails, studying the timeline, and reviewing the financial analysis. "Mom," she said finally, tears in her eyes, "I always knew you were fighting for Dad, but I didn't understand how much you were fighting for all of us. This isn't just about one family's tragedy. You've exposed a system that treats people like disposable resources." The evidence vault had taken 9 years to build, but it would prove invaluable in the final phase of our battle. Morrison Engineering thought they were facing a grief-stricken widow with conspiracy theories. They were actually facing the most comprehensive documentation of corporate negligence and government cover-up in modern legal history. Every lie they had told was documented. Every contradiction was highlighted. Every attempt to hide the truth was meticulously recorded. They had created their own evidence trail of criminal behavior, and I had been collecting it, piece by piece, for nearly a decade. The vault contained 50,847 individual pieces of evidence, cross-referenced and organized by date, source, and relevance. It included audio recordings, document analysis, financial records, witness testimonies, technical reports, and photographic evidence. Most importantly, it told a complete story, not just of how David and 46 others had died, but of how powerful institutions had conspired to hide their murders. Morrison Engineering had spent years trying to discredit me as an unreliable witness, but my evidence vault proved that I had been the most reliable chronicler of their crimes. While they were crafting lies and destroying documents, I was preserving the truth for history to judge. Now it was time to use that truth to destroy them. The decision to go fully public with our evidence came after Morrison Engineering made one final miscalculation. In January 2021, exactly 10 years after David's death, their lawyers filed a motion asking the court to seal all evidence in our case, claiming that public disclosure would compromise national security and damage critical U.S.-Japan diplomatic relationships. They were trying to hide the truth behind a veil of patriotism and international relations. It was their most audacious lie yet, and it convinced me that half measures wouldn't work. If Morrison Engineering wanted to claim national security privilege to cover up corporate murder, then the American people deserved to know exactly what they were hiding. Working with Daniel Kim, the investigative journalist who had produced the Sundance documentary, I made a decision that would either vindicate everything I had fought for, or destroy what remained of my credibility. We would release the most damning evidence from my vault simultaneously across multiple platforms, making it impossible for corporate lawyers or government officials to suppress. The coordinated release began on March 11, 2021, the 10th anniversary of David's death. Daniel's team had spent months preparing the materials, working with document verification experts, cybersecurity specialists, and international journalists to ensure maximum impact and authenticity. At 9 a.m. Eastern Time, The Guardian published the first story, Fukushima Files: How Nuclear Companies Calculated Foreign Worker Deaths as Acceptable Losses. The article included key excerpts from TEPCO's internal memos and Morrison email chains, along with expert analysis explaining the significance of each revelation. 30 minutes later, The Washington Post released their investigation, The Fukushima Cover-Up: How U.S. Officials Helped Hide Nuclear Deaths. Their story focused on the State Department's role in suppressing information about American casualties and supporting Morrison Engineering's legal defense. By noon, major news outlets across 6 continents were running stories based on our leaked documents. Le Monde, Der Spiegel, Asahi Shimbun, The Times of London, and dozens of other publications had been given exclusive access to different aspects of the evidence, creating a coordinated global exposure that no single government or corporation could contain. But the most powerful platform was social media. Working with Emma and her college friends, we had prepared a comprehensive digital campaign that would make the evidence accessible to younger audiences who got their news from Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok rather than traditional media. The hashtag Fukushima Files began trending worldwide within hours. Emma had created a series of infographics that translated complex corporate documents into easily understandable visual summaries. One particularly powerful image showed David's final safety report next to Morrison Engineering's email dismissing his concerns, with the caption, "They knew, they didn't care, he died." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Morrison Engineering's stock price plummeted 47% in the first day of trading after the revelations. TEPCO faced renewed calls for criminal prosecution from the Japanese Diet. The State Department was forced to issue a statement defending their officials' actions while promising a thorough review of the documents. More importantly, our revelations sparked investigations by law enforcement agencies that had previously been uninterested in our case. The FBI announced they were opening a criminal investigation into Morrison Engineering's destruction of evidence. The Securities and Exchange Commission began examining whether the company had defrauded investors by hiding the true costs and risks of their international operations. International prosecutors were equally responsive. French authorities opened their own investigation into Arriva's role in Philippe Dubois' death. Norwegian officials announced a criminal review of safety violations that led to Erik Larsen's death. The International Criminal Court indicated they would examine whether the systematic targeting of foreign workers constituted crimes against humanity. But the revelation that shocked me most was the response from inside the nuclear industry itself. Within 48 hours of our document release, 17 current and former nuclear industry employees contacted us with additional evidence of similar practices at other companies and facilities. Sarah Martinez, our original whistleblower from Morrison Engineering, called me crying, "Rachel, you've given people permission to tell the truth. For 10 years, we've all been carrying the guilt of what happened at Fukushima. Now maybe we can finally make it right." The additional whistleblowers provided evidence that Morrison Engineering's practices at Fukushima weren't anomalous, they were standard operating procedure for international nuclear projects. Companies routinely assigned foreign workers to the most dangerous tasks while protecting domestic employees. Safety warnings were systematically ignored when they would impact profitability. Foreign casualties were consistently underreported or attributed to natural causes. David hadn't just died because of one company's negligence. He had died because an entire industry had decided that foreign workers' lives were acceptable costs of doing business. Morrison Engineering's response to our document release was panicked and contradictory. They simultaneously claimed the documents were fabricated while also arguing they were stolen through illegal means. They hired a crisis management firm that launched a social media campaign claiming I was a foreign agent, spreading anti-American propaganda designed to damage the U.S. nuclear industry. The desperation was obvious and counterproductive. When Morrison's CEO James Morrison appeared on CNBC to defend his company, he was asked directly about the email chains showing his personal approval of foreign worker assignments to high-risk operations. "Those emails are taken out of context," Morrison stammered. "Mrs. Williams is a disturbed individual who has manipulated documents to support her conspiracy theories." The CNBC host immediately pointed out that independent forensic experts had verified the documents' authenticity, and that Morrison's own IT department had confirmed the emails came from his personal corporate account. "Mr. Morrison, are you claiming someone hacked your email to plant false evidence?" Morrison's non-answer spoke volumes. "We're confident that when all the facts come out, Morrison Engineering will be vindicated." But the facts were already out, and they were devastating to Morrison Engineering's credibility. The coordinated document release had accomplished something that 10 years of litigation couldn't achieve. It had made the truth impossible to ignore or suppress. Government officials who had spent years dismissing our allegations as conspiracy theories were suddenly scrambling to distance themselves from Morrison Engineering. Congressional representatives who had previously supported the company began calling for investigations. Diplomatic officials who had helped suppress information about foreign casualties claimed they had been misled by corporate representatives. Most satisfying was the response from the mainstream media outlets that had initially refused to cover our story. The same network executives who had killed the 60 Minutes segment about our case were now demanding exclusive interviews and behind-the-scenes access to our investigation. "Mrs. Williams," one producer told me, "your story is exactly the kind of corporate accountability journalism that America needs right now." It was the same story they had been too afraid to tell when Morrison Engineering threatened lawsuits. Now that the truth was undeniable, they wanted to claim credit for exposing it. The document release had transformed our legal position overnight. We were no longer isolated plaintiffs making accusations against powerful defendants. We were whistleblowers who had exposed one of the largest corporate cover-ups in modern history, with documentary evidence that no jury could ignore. Morrison Engineering had spent 10 years trying to bury the truth about Fukushima. In one coordinated day, we had made sure that truth would never be buried again. The congressional hearing was scheduled for April 15, 2021. Exactly 10 years and 1 month after my first CNN interview, the House Committee on Energy and Commerce had announced a full investigation into nuclear contractor safety practices and government oversight failures, with particular focus on the Fukushima incident and the subsequent cover-up. I was called as the lead witness, followed by James Morrison, current and former government officials, and nuclear industry representatives. The hearing was expected to last 3 days and would be broadcast live on C-SPAN, providing the national platform our case had always deserved. The night before my testimony, I sat in my hotel room in Washington, D.C., reviewing the statement I had prepared. Emma and Michael had flown in from their respective colleges to support me, and we spent the evening going through David's photos and letters, remembering the man whose death had brought us to this moment. "Are you nervous, Mom?" Michael asked, as we sat in the hotel restaurant. "Terrified," I admitted, "but also ready. Your father died trying to prevent a catastrophe. If my testimony can prevent other families from going through what we've experienced, then everything we've endured will have been worth it." The hearing room was packed with journalists, nuclear industry representatives, family members of other Fukushima victims, and congressional staff. I recognized several faces from our 10-year journey. Claire Dubois had flown in from France. Dr. Yamamoto was in the gallery, and Sarah Martinez sat in the front row. Finally able to publicly support the truth she had helped expose, Committee Chairman Frank Pallone opened the hearing with a statement that validated everything we had fought for. The evidence presented to this committee suggests a systematic pattern of negligence, cover-up, and disregard for human life by both private corporations and government officials. The American people deserve to know how 47 foreign workers died at Fukushima, why their deaths were hidden, and what we're doing to prevent similar tragedies. When I was sworn in and took my seat at the witness table, I looked directly at the committee members and began. Chairman Pallone, Ranking Member McMorris Rogers, members of the committee, my name is Rachel Williams. 13 years ago, my husband David was murdered by corporate negligence at Fukushima. For 13 years, I have fought to expose the truth about his death and the deaths of 46 other foreign workers whose sacrifice has been erased from history. I spent 2 hours methodically walking through our evidence, explaining how Morrison Engineering and TEPCO had calculated that foreign worker deaths were more cost-effective than safety improvements. I detailed the systematic destruction of evidence, the coordination between corporations and government officials to suppress information, and the vicious campaign to discredit survivors and their families. The most powerful moment came when I read directly from David's final safety report. The cooling system vulnerabilities we identified are getting progressively worse. TEPCO management is prioritizing reactor output over basic safety protocols. If we experience another major seismic event, this facility will become a death trap for everyone working here. Mr. Chairman, I continued, my husband knew he was in danger. He documented that danger. He reported it to his supervisors, and he was ordered to ignore his concerns and continue working in conditions that his own professional judgment told him were lethal. Republican committee members, clearly briefed by Morrison Engineering's lobbyists, attempted to discredit my testimony by questioning my technical expertise and suggesting I had misinterpreted complex engineering documents. Representative Kathy McMorris Rogers asked whether I had the scientific background necessary to understand nuclear reactor safety protocols. My response drew applause from the gallery. Representative McMorris Rogers, I may not be a nuclear engineer, but I can read emails. And the emails show that Morrison Engineering executives knew foreign workers would probably die and decided it was an acceptable business expense. You don't need a PhD in nuclear physics to understand that calculating human deaths as acceptable losses is morally and legally wrong. When James Morrison testified later that afternoon, his performance was a disaster for his company. Under questioning from Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Morrison was forced to admit that he had personally approved the assignment of foreign workers to high-risk operations while ensuring that American management personnel were evacuated to safe areas. Mr. Morrison, Representative Ocasio-Cortez pressed, did you consider the families of these foreign workers when you made the decision to use them as what your own documents call expendable personnel? Morrison's response was tone-deaf and revealing, Congresswoman, these were business decisions made under extraordinary circumstances. We had to prioritize the safety of our core American personnel while utilizing available international resources to address the emergency. International resources. Mr. Morrison, you're talking about human beings, husbands and fathers who never came home because you decided their lives were worth less than your American employees' lives. Morrison's attempt to justify the unjustifiable only made our case stronger. His clinical language about utilizing available international resources demonstrated exactly the dehumanizing mindset that had led to David's death. The hearing's most dramatic moment came when Representative Katie Porter presented Morrison with a detailed financial analysis of his company's choices. Using a whiteboard, she broke down the costs. Mr. Morrison, implementing the safety measures recommended by your own engineers would have cost $12 million. Instead, you chose to spend $73 million over 10 years covering up the deaths that resulted from not implementing those safety measures. Can you explain to the American people why spending 6 times more money to hide deaths was preferable to spending less money to prevent them? Morrison had no answer. His stammering non-response became the sound bite that played on every news program that evening. But the most emotionally powerful testimony came from Dr. Yamamoto. who had risked his career and safety to expose the truth about Fukushima. Speaking slowly and deliberately, he told the committee, "I have worked in nuclear industry for 35 years. I believed we were making energy safer for humanity. Learning that my colleagues calculated foreign worker deaths as business expense has destroyed my faith in my profession. These men died heroes, trying to prevent catastrophe. They deserved better from their employers and their governments." The hearing concluded with Chairman Poloni announcing that the committee would recommend criminal referrals to the Department of Justice for Morrison Engineering executives and would propose legislation requiring enhanced safety protections for foreign workers at American nuclear facilities. As I left the Capitol building that evening, surrounded by Emma, Michael, and supporters who had followed our case for years, I felt something I hadn't experienced since David's death. Hope that justice might actually be possible. The congressional hearing had accomplished what 10 years of litigation couldn't achieve. It had forced Morrison Engineering executives to publicly admit their negligence under oath. It had exposed the government officials who had helped cover up foreign worker deaths. Most importantly, it had given David and the other 46 victims a platform where their sacrifice was finally acknowledged and honored. The reckoning we had fought for was finally beginning. The final settlement negotiations took place in August 2021, 13 years and 5 months after David's death. The congressional hearing had fundamentally shifted the power dynamic. Morrison Engineering was no longer negotiating from a position of strength, but desperately trying to avoid criminal prosecution and complete corporate destruction. The settlement terms reflected our newfound leverage. Morrison Engineering agreed to pay $127 million to the families of the 47 foreign workers who died at Fukushima, nearly 10 times their previous offers. But more importantly, they agreed to full accountability measures that would prevent future tragedies. Morrison Engineering was required to establish the David Williams Nuclear Safety Institute, funded with $50 million and dedicated to developing enhanced safety protocols for foreign workers at nuclear facilities worldwide. The institute would be governed by an independent board including family members of Fukushima victims, nuclear engineers, and international safety experts. Additionally, Morrison Engineering had to create a public memorial website documenting the lives and service of all 47 foreign workers who died at Fukushima, ensuring their sacrifice would never be forgotten or denied again. Each worker's story would be told completely and honestly, with input from their families and colleagues. But perhaps most significantly, Morrison Engineering agreed to support federal legislation requiring enhanced safety protections and reporting requirements for foreign workers at American nuclear facilities. The legislation, introduced as the David Williams Nuclear Worker Protection Act, would make it a federal crime to assign foreign workers to disproportionately dangerous tasks or to suppress information about foreign casualties in nuclear incidents. James Morrison himself was forced to record a public apology that was played at the congressional hearing's conclusion. "I personally apologize to the families of the 47 foreign workers who died at Fukushima while working for Morrison Engineering and our partner companies. Their deaths were preventable, and our company's actions following the disaster were inexcusable. I take full responsibility for the decisions that led to this tragedy and the subsequent attempts to avoid accountability." The criminal investigations proceeded separately from our civil settlement. In September 2021, the Department of Justice announced federal charges against Morrison Engineering for obstruction of justice, destruction of evidence, and conspiracy to defraud investors. James Morrison and 3 other executives were personally indicted on charges that could result in substantial prison sentences. But for me, the most meaningful resolution wasn't financial or legal, it was personal. In October 2021, exactly 10 years and 7 months after David's death, Emma and Michael joined me in Japan for the dedication of a memorial garden at the Fukushima Daiichi site. The memorial, funded by our settlement and built in collaboration with Japanese authorities, honored all workers who died during the disaster, both Japanese and foreign. David's name was engraved on black granite alongside his 46 colleagues, their sacrifice finally acknowledged in the place where they had given their lives. Standing in that memorial garden with my children, I felt David's presence more strongly than I had since the night he died. Emma placed white flowers by his nameplate while Michael read aloud from one of David's safety reports. "Nuclear power can help humanity, but only if we never forget that human life is more precious than any profit margin or political convenience." Dr. Yamamoto, now in his 70s, joined us for the memorial ceremony. Your husband would be proud, he told me, as we stood before David's memorial stone. His death exposed truth that will save many lives. He did not die in vain. The healing extended beyond our immediate family. Our international coalition of survivor families had grown into a permanent advocacy organization called Fukushima Truth International. We provide support for families of nuclear workers, advocate for enhanced safety protocols, and investigate corporate misconduct in the nuclear industry. Claire Dubois became the organization's executive director, using her legal training to help other families navigate complex international jurisdiction issues. Maria Santos established a scholarship program for children of nuclear workers pursuing safety engineering degrees. Yuki Tanaka created a documentation project recording the stories of all Fukushima workers, ensuring their experiences are preserved for future generations. Emma, now in her senior year at Stanford, is writing her thesis on corporate accountability and historical memory. She plans to attend law school and specialize in international human rights law. Inspired by our family's 13-year journey toward justice. Michael chose to study nuclear engineering after all, but with a focus on safety systems and worker protection. I want to build the systems Dad would have designed, he told me. Systems that put human life before everything else. The financial settlement provided security our family had never known. I was able to pay off our legal debts, establish college funds for Emma and Michael, and purchase the house where we could finally create stable, peaceful lives. But the money was never the point. It was the acknowledgement that David's life had mattered, that his death was a big injustice that demanded accountability. Morrison Engineering's business never recovered from the scandal. Their stock price collapsed, government contracts were canceled, and international partners terminated their relationships with the company. In December 2022, Morrison Engineering filed for bankruptcy. Its assets sold to pay legal settlements and criminal fines. James Morrison was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for obstruction of justice and conspiracy charges. In his final statement before sentencing, he said, "I spent 10 years trying to hide from the truth about what my company did at Fukushima. Mrs. Williams never let me forget that truth, and ultimately she was right to hold us accountable." As I write this, in March 2024, exactly 13 years after David's death, I often think about the journey that brought us to this point. David died believing that nuclear power could benefit humanity if implemented with proper safety measures and respect for human life. Our 13-year fight proved that he was right, but only when ordinary people are willing to demand accountability from powerful institutions. The emotionally unstable widow that Morrison Engineering tried to discredit had exposed one of the largest corporate cover-ups in modern history. The conspiracy theorist they tried to silence had provided documented proof of an international conspiracy to hide industrial murder. The disturbed individual they tried to destroy had helped create legislation that will protect countless future workers. David's death was a tragedy that could have been prevented, but his legacy preserved and protected through our fight for truth will prevent future tragedies for generations to come. That's not just justice. It's healing on a scale I never imagined possible. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not by governments or corporations, but by ordinary people who refuse to accept that injustice is inevitable. David taught me that safety matters more than profit. Our 13-year journey taught me that truth matters more than power. And sometimes, if you fight long enough and document carefully enough and never give up, even the most powerful enemies of truth can be forced to acknowledge what they've done. David Williams died a hero at Fukushima, but he lived forever in the justice we finally achieved.